Secrets According to Humphrey, Chapter 8. Secrets, secrets everywhere. So who solved the riddle of the Sphinx? Mrs. Brisbane asked the next morning. I certainly didn't raise my paw, but I was surprised to see almost every hand go up. I was amazed. Were there actually any three-legged creatures? I wonder how many of you figured it out on your own, and how many looked it up, the teacher said. How about you, Thomas? I looked it up. It was in one of my library books, Thomas said. Paul F., did you look it up? Mrs. Brisbane asked. Paul looked down at the desk. He seemed embarrassed. I didn't say you couldn't look it up, Mrs. Brisbane said. In fact, if you couldn't solve it on your own, I think it would be smart to look it up. Small Paul and most of the students in the class looked relieved. I would have looked it up in the library, but I couldn't find the right book, I squeaked. Mrs. Brisbane looked over at my cage and smiled. I wonder if Humphrey knows the answer, she said. No, but I wish I did, I replied. Of course, all she heard was squeak, squeak, squeak. So who's going to tell me what creature walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs in the afternoon, and 3 legs in the evening? Mrs. Brisbane asked. Hands were waving everywhere, but she called on Stop Talking Sophie. I looked it up online, and the answer is humans, because the beginning of life is like the morning, when people are babies and they crawl on all 4 legs. In the afternoon, when they're older, they walk on 2 legs. And in the evening, when they're very old, some people sometimes walk with a cane. Once you know the answer, it seems easy. But before I looked it up, it seemed impossible to answer it all, Sophie answered without even taking a breath. That's true, Sophie, Mrs. Brisbane said. I think all riddles seem easy once you know the answer, but the legend is that many travelers lost their lives because they didn't figure it out. Rosie raised her hand. Why didn't the travelers look it up? They couldn't go online back then, Thomas said. They didn't have computers that long ago. I read about it in a book, but they probably didn't have books either. They didn't have books the way we do, our teacher explained. They had papyrus. It was very expensive, so hardly anyone had any. Students who were learning to write practice on bits of stone. Thomas groaned. That would sure make your backpack heavy. That made everyone laugh, including Mrs. Brisbane. I was glad I had my little notebook, which hardly weighed a thing. Imagine if a small hamster had to write on stones. Next, Mrs. Brisbane taught math, but it was a very funny kind of math they used in ancient Egypt. Instead of numbers, they used symbols, and there were only 7 of them. Each one was a single line. That was easy, but as the numbers moved up, the symbols were stranger and stranger. A coil of rope stood for 10. A finger represented 10,000, which is a very large number. When Mrs. Brisbane showed us the symbol for 100,000, Og let out an extra loud boing. The symbol for 100,000 was a frog. Boing, boing, boing. Of course, my friends all laughed. When Mrs. Brisbane finished showing us all of the symbols, I was disappointed that one of them was not a hamster. But I was happy there was at least a frog. Really. Mrs. Brisbane put up some math problems for the class to solve using the symbols. Near the end of the class, Mr. Fitch appeared carrying a book. I scrambled up to the tippy top of my cage and saw that the book had a dark red cover. I crossed my toes and hoped. Sorry to interrupt, he said. I found this book with a hole slip for Joey in room 26. I thought I'd bring it down in case he needs it. First, just Joey looked surprised. Then he frowned and shook his head. Not for me. Mr. Fitch walked to Joey's table and handed him the book. It's a good one, he said. Joey took the book. The slip I'd written on was still tucked inside, and Joey read it. Thanks, he said, but he looked confused. Thanks, I squeaked. What's the book? Mrs. Brisbane asked when Mr. Fitch was gone. It's called The Jungle Book, Joey said. It has a lot of animals in it. Mrs. Brisbane looked pleased, and I was happy that my plan had worked. But I still wasn't sure that Joey would like the book. Mrs. Brisbane kept on talking, but Joey wasn't listening. He opened the book and stared at the first page. I think that Mrs. Brisbane knew that Joey wasn't listening, but she didn't say anything. Joey turned the page. I crossed my toes again. My poor toes were aching by the time Mrs. Brisbane split the class up into their groups. I wanted to keep track of Joey in the book, but there were so many things going on, I forgot. First, Phoebe waved her hand at Kelsey, wiggled her fingers, and winked. I guess Kelsey forgot that she was helping to hold up the blocks for the pyramid. She started to return the signal while Simon was gluing the next one on. The pyramid collapsed into a heap of blocks. "Now look what you've done," Simon said. I didn't blame him for being irritated. Rosie was annoyed as well. "What happened?" Mrs. Brisbane asked when she rushed over to the table. "Kelsey let go," Simon said. "It was an accident," Kelsey said. "Well, be careful, Kelsey," Mrs. Brisbane said. "Help Simon and Rosie set it up again." The room was peaceful for a few minutes, but then Joey shouted, "Hey, watch out, Sophie. You almost got paint on my book." When I glanced at Sophie, she was looking at Rosie. Both of them had very red faces. Mrs. Brisbane hurried over to the artist. "What happened here?" "She's acting strange," Joey said. "She was making these weird moves. I think she flipped out or something." "Joey, that's not a nice thing to say," Mrs. Brisbane said. "I think there was a fly buzzing around my head, or maybe it was a bee or a mosquito, and I was trying to wave it away, and I spilled some paint, but not on his book," Sophie explained. "I think that she was performing her secret sign for her secret club." Once the class was back at work and Mrs. Brisbane was talking to the scribes, Small Paul, Tall Paul, and Fix-It Philippe spread their arms like wings and said something that sounded really strange. I think I heard "flying pharaohs" in the middle. That made Joey look up from his book and frowned. Maybe it was because they interrupted his reading, but maybe he wanted to be in a secret club too. Holly watched all the strange signals too, and she didn't look happy about it either. Just before the bell rang, while my friends were cleaning up their tables, Thomas tapped Joey on the shoulder and pointed at the book. "I read that one," he said. "Do you like it?" "It's pretty cool. I'd like to live in the jungle with those animals," Joey said, "but it's awfully long." Thomas shrugged. "So what? Doesn't matter how long a book is. You start at the beginning and keep reading till you get to the end. When you get to the end, you start another book." Joey thought for a moment, and then he grinned. "I can do that." It had been an unsqueakably strange day, but at least one thing had turned out right. Joey liked the book. When the room was empty, I hopped on my wheel and spun as fast as I could. I was going so fast. At first, I didn't notice that Mr. Morales had come into room 26. He was talking to Mrs. Brisbane near the door. Sometimes I wish I had a brake on my hamster wheel. But I spun slower and slower until I could hop off and listen. "So far it looks as if the plan will work out," Mr. Morales said. "I got this from her mom today." He handed Mrs. Brisbane a piece of paper. "Wonderful," she said as she read it. "Oh, the whole class will love this. We might even get the local television station to cover it," he said. "There's never been anything like this at Longfellow School, but the important thing is we have to keep it a secret." Mrs. Brisbane put a finger on her lips. "My lips are sealed," she said. That couldn't be true, because if her lips were sealed, she couldn't talk. Humans say the strangest things sometimes. "You hear that, Humphrey and Og?" Mr. Morales pointed toward her table. "Not a peep out of you about the secret. I like Mr. Morales, and he is the most important person at Longfellow School, but I had to squeak up for myself. 'I don't even know the secret,' I squeaked at the top of my lungs, 'and I don't say peep, and neither does Og.'" "Boing, boing," my froggy friend agreed. Mr. Morales chuckled. "I guess he's saying the secret is safe with him." Well, he was wrong about that. After more talking, they both left room 26 for the day. Og and I were alone at last. I jiggled my lock that doesn't lock and scampered over to Og's tank. "I don't understand," I squeaked. "Why is everyone so happy that one of our students is leaving?" Og splashed, and I had to scurry away to keep from getting wet. I don't ever want to get wet. When he settled down, I moved closer again. "But did you hear what Mr. Morales said?" "He said her, Mom. So the person leaving is a girl." "Boing, boing, boing," Og boomed. I didn't want one of the girls to leave our class either. I didn't want anyone to leave. "And why would the television people come just because one girl is leaving?" I continued. "I thought reporters usually cover car chases and weather and market where you can buy socks. Although why they report on this sock market every day seems weird to me." "Boing," Og agreed. I realized that Alda would be coming to clean soon, so I hurried back to my cage and slammed the door behind me. Before long, I heard the rattle, rattle, rattle of his cleaning cart. The door opened, and when he switched on the lights, the room was as bright as it was during the day. "Hey, how are my favorite students in room 26?" he asked. Before I could answer, he was busily sweeping the floor. I watched Aldo carefully as he worked because I knew he had a secret too, and maybe he would give us a clue like Mrs. Brisbane did. But his lips were sealed. He didn't say a word, or a peep. When he was gone, I opened my little notebook, and by the glow of the streetlights, I added some things to my list. Human secrets I know about. A student is leaving room 26 soon. I don't know which student, and I don't know when. It's a girl. Sophie still misses her old school. What if she's going back? Kelsey's dad wants to take the whole family to New York City. Maybe they're moving there? Question: why would they send a television reporter to cover either of those? I nibbled on my pencil for a minute. Then I added something that made me happy. Joey's secret is that he doesn't enjoy reading. Will my plan work? Yes, I think it will. Humphrey's top secret scribbles. A girl will be leaving us any day. Is there some way to make her stay?